The glass shattered against the marble floor before anyone could stop it. Alexander Voss sat frozen in his wheelchair, at the head of the long dining table, his knuckles white against the armrests. The sound of breaking glass still echoed through the hall, but nobody moved to clean it up. Nobody dared. "Say that again," Alexander said quietly. His voice was calm, but calm in the way a storm is calm, before it destroys everything in its path. The man standing across from him, an older doctor with silver hair and trembling hands, swallowed hard. "My lord, I have examined you for the 4th time this year. There is nothing wrong with your spine, nothing wrong with your nerves. By every measure of medicine, you should be able to walk, and yet you cannot. I do not have an answer for you." "Then you are useless to me," Alexander said. "Like the 12 before you." The doctor bowed quickly and left the room, his footsteps fading down the long corridor of the Voss estate. The remaining advisors stood in silence, afraid to speak, afraid to breathe too loudly. This had become a familiar scene. 20 years of the same words, spoken by different doctors, in different rooms, in different countries. 20 years of hope, crushed under the same disappointing sentence. Alexander closed his eyes and pressed his palm against his forehead. He was 38 years old, and he had spent more than half his life unable to feel his legs. He had once been called the strongest man in the region, a leader whose strength was legendary, before his body betrayed him. Now he was simply Alexander Voss, the man in the chair. The Alpha King who could not stand to claim his own throne room without someone pushing him there. He remembered the accident as if it happened yesterday, though the memory had grown foggy at the edges from being replayed so many times. He had been 18, hunting in the northern forest with his father and his closest friends. There had been a fall from a high ridge, a fall that should have killed him instantly. Instead, he woke up 3 days later in his bed, alive, breathing, whole in every way except one. His legs simply stopped answering him. The doctors called it paralysis. His family called it a curse. Alexander called it a prison. "My lord," said Gregory, his most trusted advisor, stepping forward carefully, "perhaps it is time to rest. The council meeting can wait until morning." "The council meeting cannot wait," Alexander snapped. "Nothing waits. The world does not pause because I am broken." Gregory said nothing. He had worked for the Voss family for 15 years, and in that time, he had learned when to speak and when to simply stand nearby, ready to help. Alexander was proud, fiercely proud, and admitting weakness was something he refused to do in front of others. But Gregory saw it anyway. He saw the way Alexander's shoulders sagged when he thought no one was watching. He saw the way his jaw tightened whenever someone mentioned walking, running, or dancing. "Take me to my study," Alexander said finally. Gregory nodded and wheeled him down the hallway, past portraits of Voss ancestors who had all stood tall and proud in their painted images. Alexander avoided looking at them. He always avoided looking at them. The estate itself was massive, built from dark stone and towering wood, sitting on a hill that overlooked the entire valley below. From the outside, it looked like a fortress belonging to royalty, which in many ways it was. The Voss family had led their people for generations, and their influence stretched far beyond the borders of the valley. Alexander had inherited that legacy at the age of 25, taking his father's place as leader, after years of preparing for the role. He had done everything expected of him. He had built alliances, expanded their influence, and kept peace among rival families, who would have loved nothing more than to see the Voss name fall. But none of it mattered, when he looked down and saw legs that refused to move. In his study, surrounded by shelves of old books and papers detailing decades of failed treatments, Alexander stared out the window at the valley below. The evening sky had turned orange and pink, the sun sinking behind the distant mountains. Somewhere out there, ordinary people were living ordinary lives, walking to their homes, running after their children, dancing at celebrations, simple things that Alexander could only watch from a distance. He thought about the doctor who had just left, another name added to the long list of failures. He thought about the specialists flown in from other countries, the healers brought in from remote villages who claimed to have ancient remedies, the researchers who studied his condition for months, only to shrug their shoulders in confusion. 20 years. 20 years of hoping. 20 years of disappointment. His mother, before she passed, used to tell him that everything happened for a reason. Alexander had stopped believing that a long time ago. There was no reason for this. There was no lesson to be learned from watching your own body fail you, while your mind remained sharp and aware of every single thing you were missing. A knock came at the door. "Enter," Alexander said, not turning around. It was his younger sister, Eleanor. She was the only family member who still visited him without an agenda, without trying to convince him to remarry or step down, or hand over more responsibilities to someone else. She simply cared, and that made her rare in a household full of ambition. "I heard the doctor left disappointed," she said, sitting in the chair across from his desk. "I disappointed him," Alexander corrected. "He had nothing to offer me." Eleanor studied her brother's face. There were lines there now, lines that had not existed when he was young and full of fire. 20 years of frustration had aged him in ways that had nothing to do with time. "You cannot keep doing this to yourself," she said gently, bringing in doctor after doctor, hoping for a different answer. "What else am I supposed to do? Accept it?" "Maybe," Eleanor said. "Maybe acceptance is not giving up. Maybe it is simply choosing to live instead of waiting." Alexander turned his chair to face her, his expression hard. "You don't understand what it means to lose everything you were supposed to become." "No," Eleanor admitted, "I don't. But I understand what it means to lose someone you love to bitterness. And that is exactly what is happening to you, brother, whether you see it or not." She left the room after that, leaving Alexander alone with his thoughts once again. He sat by the window for a long time, watching the last light disappear behind the mountains, thinking about nothing and everything all at once. The next morning brought no relief. Alexander woke early, as he always did, and went through the same routine that had defined his mornings for 2 decades. His assistant helped him dress, helped him into his chair, and wheeled him through the halls toward his office where stacks of papers and reports awaited his attention. Being unable to walk had never stopped him from running his territory. If anything, it had made him more determined to prove that his mind and his authority remained untouched, even if his body had failed him. But today, something felt different. Perhaps it was the argument with Eleanor, still lingering in his thoughts. Perhaps it was simple exhaustion, after 20 years of the same disappointment. Whatever the reason, Alexander found himself restless, unable to focus on the documents in front of him. "Gregory," he said, setting down a report he had read 3 times, without absorbing a single word. "I need to leave the estate for a while." Gregory raised an eyebrow. Alexander rarely left the estate, unless it was for official business. "Where would you like to go, my lord?" "I don't know," Alexander admitted. "Just away from here, away from these walls." They drove for nearly an hour, with no destination in mind, following winding roads through the countryside as gray clouds gathered overhead. Alexander stared out the window, watching fields and small towns pass by, feeling the weight of his own thoughts pressing down on him. Then the rain came, sudden and heavy, forcing the driver to pull off the main road and find shelter. They ended up outside a small diner on the edge of a quiet town, its windows glowing warm and yellow against the darkening sky. "We should wait out the storm here, my lord," the driver suggested. Alexander sighed, in no mood for public places, but the rain showed no sign of stopping, and his frustration had reached its limit. "Fine. Help me inside." The diner was small, modest, and smelled of coffee and fried food. A handful of customers sat scattered at various tables, paying little attention to the well-dressed stranger being wheeled through the door. Alexander was grateful for that, at least. He had grown tired of the stares, the whispers, the pity that followed him wherever he went, among people who recognized his name. They settled into a booth near the window, and Alexander stared out at the rain streaking down the glass, lost once again in his thoughts. He barely noticed when someone approached the table. "Evening," said a warm voice. "Terrible weather to be out in, isn't it?" Alexander looked up, mildly annoyed at being interrupted, and found himself looking at a young woman with kind eyes and an easy smile. She wore a simple uniform, an apron tied around her waist, and held a notepad in one hand. "I suppose it is," Alexander said flatly, unwilling to engage further. "Can I get you something warm? We've got fresh coffee, and the soup tonight is pretty good if I do say so myself," the woman continued, unbothered by his cold tone. "Coffee is fine," Alexander said, turning his attention back to the window. The woman jotted down the order and glanced briefly at his wheelchair, though not with the pity Alexander had grown to expect. It was something else entirely, something closer to simple curiosity, as if she were noticing a detail about a person rather than making a judgment about their worth. "I'll be right back," she said, and disappeared toward the kitchen. Alexander did not think much of the exchange. It was a small, unremarkable moment in an unremarkable diner during an unremarkable storm. He had no way of knowing that this brief, ordinary interaction would become the first thread in a story that would change everything he thought he understood about his own life. The coffee arrived a few minutes later, along with a small basket of bread the woman insisted was on the house, since he looked like he needed something to warm him up on such a miserable night. Alexander accepted it without much comment, still lost in the fog of his own frustrations, still carrying the weight of 20 years pressing down on his shoulders. Outside, the storm continued to rage, rain hammering against the windows, thunder rolling in the distance. Inside the small diner, Alexander Voss sat quietly, unaware that his entire world was about to be turned upside down by a waitress he had barely noticed, in a place he had never intended to visit, on a night he had only stumbled into by chance. For now, he simply drank his coffee and watched the storm, carrying the same heavy silence he had carried for 2 decades. But something in the air had shifted, subtle and unnoticed, the way the first crack forms in ice, long before anyone realizes the whole surface is about to break apart. 20 years of searching for a cure had led him to countless doctors, countless hospitals, countless disappointments. He never imagined that the answer might be waiting for him in the last place he expected, wearing an apron and carrying a pot of coffee, smiling at strangers as if the world had not yet given her a reason to stop being kind. The storm would pass by morning, but Alexander Voss would never be quite the same again. Lillian Carter had been on her feet since 5 in the morning, and by the time the storm rolled in, her legs ached in a way that made her grateful for the slow evening crowd. The diner was quiet, except for the rain hammering against the windows, and the low hum of the old radio behind the counter, playing songs from decades before she was born. She had noticed the black car pull up outside, sleek and expensive, completely out of place on this side of town. She had noticed the man being helped into a wheelchair by a driver who moved with careful precision, as if handling something valuable and fragile at the same time. And she had noticed the way the man's face carried an expression she recognized instantly, though she could not have explained why. It was the look of someone who had given up on being surprised by life. Lily had seen that look before, on the face of her grandmother during her final years, and on her own face, some mornings when she stared into the bathroom mirror before her shift. It was the look of exhaustion that went deeper than tired muscles or long hours. It was the exhaustion of the soul. She approached his table anyway, because that was simply who she was. Lily did not believe in letting people sit alone with their sadness, if she could help it, even strangers, even ones who clearly wanted to be left in peace. Her mother used to say that kindness was the only thing in this world that multiplied the more you gave it away, and Lily had built her whole life around that idea. The man had been cold, almost rude, but Lily did not take it personally. She had waited tables long enough to understand that people carried invisible burdens, and sometimes those burdens came out as short tempers or clipped words. She brought him his coffee, added the bread because something in his eyes told her he needed a small kindness, more than he needed a full meal, and went about the rest of her evening without giving it too much more thought. By the time her shift ended, the storm had softened into a light drizzle. Lily grabbed her jacket from the back room, said goodnight to Dorothy, the diner's owner, and the closest thing Lily had to family these days, and stepped out into the wet evening air. The walk home took 20 minutes, past the same shops and houses she had known her entire life. Lily had grown up in this town, in a small house 2 streets over from the diner where she now worked. Her parents were gone, her father from illness when she was 16, her mother from an accident 3 years later. Lily had been raising herself, more or less, ever since, along with taking care of her grandmother, who suffered from a condition that made her forgetful and occasionally confused about where, or even when she was. Lily loved her grandmother fiercely, the way people love the last piece of family they have left. Every evening, after her shift ended, Lily walked home to check on her, to make sure she had eaten, to make sure the stove had been turned off, to make sure the doors were locked. It was exhausting work on top of an already exhausting job, but Lily never complained. She had learned a long time ago that complaining did not pay the bills or keep the people you loved safe. When she arrived home, her grandmother was sitting in her favorite chair by the window, humming softly to herself. "There you are," her grandmother said, looking up with a warm smile. I was starting to think you had forgotten about me. Never, Lily said, kissing her grandmother's forehead. How was your day? Quiet. The neighbor's cat came by again. I gave him some milk. Lily smiled, though she made a mental note to check whether they actually had milk to spare. Money had been tight for months, ever since the diner cut everyone's hours to save costs during the slow season. Lily had taken on extra shifts wherever she could find them, cleaning houses on her days off, anything to keep the lights on, and her grandmother comfortable. She made a simple dinner that evening, nothing fancy, just enough to fill their stomachs, and sat with her grandmother at the small kitchen table, listening to stories she had heard many times before, but never tired of hearing again. Her grandmother's memory came and went like tides, some days sharp and clear, other days foggy and distant, but the stories from decades ago always seemed to remain the most vivid. Tell me about grandfather again, Lily said, though she already knew every detail by heart. Her grandmother's eyes lit up, the way they always did when this particular memory surfaced. He was the most stubborn man I ever met, she began, and Lily settled in to listen, grateful for this small piece of normalcy in an otherwise demanding life. Later that night, after her grandmother had gone to sleep, Lily sat alone in the quiet kitchen, going over the numbers in her small notebook, where she tracked every dollar that came in and went out. The math never quite worked the way she needed it to. There was always something extra required, a doctor's visit, a prescription, a repair around the house that could not wait. She thought briefly about the man from the diner, the one in the wheelchair, with the tired eyes, and the expensive car. She wondered what kind of life he lived, what kind of burdens a person like that carried. Money clearly was not one of his problems, but something about the way he looked out that window, staring into the storm as if searching for something he had lost long ago, told Lily that having money did not mean having peace. She did not think much more of him after that. Lily had her own life to manage, her own worries to carry, and strangers who passed through the diner rarely stayed in her thoughts for long. She finished her notes, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed, unaware that the stranger from that stormy evening would return again, and that his return would begin to reshape both of their lives in ways neither of them could have predicted. The next few days passed in their usual rhythm. Lily worked her shifts at the diner, cared for her grandmother in the evenings, and squeezed in a few hours of house cleaning whenever her schedule allowed. She was tired in the way that had become familiar, a tiredness that lived in her bones rather than just her muscles, but she pushed through it the same way she pushed through everything else, with quiet determination and the belief that things would eventually get easier. On Thursday evening, the black car returned. Lily noticed it the moment it pulled into the small parking lot outside the diner, the same sleek vehicle from the storm, now gleaming under the evening sun instead of rain. She watched through the window as the driver helped the same man from before out of the car and into his wheelchair, wheeling him carefully toward the entrance. Looks like your storm customer is back, Dorothy said from behind the counter, a knowing smile on her face. Dorothy had run this diner for over 20 years and had developed a habit of noticing things that others might miss. He's not my customer, Lily said, though she felt a strange flutter of curiosity she could not quite explain. He just happened to stop in during the rain. Well, he's stopping in again. And it's not raining, Dorothy pointed out. Table by the window again. Go on, take care of him. Lily approached the table with the same polite smile she gave every customer, though something about the man's presence felt different this time. He was dressed impeccably, in a way that made it clear he belonged to a world far removed from the modest diner he now sat in. His expression, however, had not changed much from the last time she saw him. Still tired, still distant. Welcome back, Lily said. No storm to blame this time. For the first time, something close to amusement flickered across the man's face. It was brief, barely noticeable, but Lily caught it anyway.
I suppose I have no excuse then,
he said.
Coffee again?
Lily asked. Please. She brought his order and left him to his thoughts, though she found herself glancing his way more often than she probably should have throughout the evening. There was something about him that she could not quite place, a kind of sadness that ran deeper than ordinary bad days, a heaviness that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He stayed for nearly an hour, working quietly on a laptop that seemed entirely out of place in the modest diner, occasionally glancing up whenever Lily passed by his table. When he finally left, he left a tip that made Lily's eyes widen in surprise. far more than the bill required. "That's generous," Dorothy commented, watching the black car pull away from the window. "Too generous," Lily said, tucking the money carefully into her apron pocket, already calculating how much of her grandmother's medication it would cover. She did not know his name. She did not know anything about him beyond the wheelchair and the sadness in his eyes. But something told Lily that this would not be the last time she saw him, and for reasons she could not entirely explain, she found herself looking forward to finding out if she was right. The third visit happened on a Tuesday, and by then, Dorothy had stopped pretending she did not notice a pattern forming. Alexander Voss arrived just after 6 in the evening, wheeled in by his driver, who by now nodded politely at Lily, as if they had reached some silent understanding. Lily greeted him with the same warmth she offered every guest, though she had started to notice small details about him that she had not caught before. The way his jaw tightened slightly whenever anyone offered to help him with something he could manage himself. The way his eyes studied every corner of the room, as if he were used to watching for danger, even in the safest of places. The way his hands, strong and steady, seemed completely disconnected from the legs that refused to hold his weight. "You're becoming a regular," Lily said, setting his coffee down without being asked. "Is that a complaint?" Alexander asked, raising an eyebrow. "Not at all. Regulars are good for business. Dorothy likes regulars." "And what do you like?" he asked, the question slipping out before he seemed to fully consider it. Lily paused, caught slightly off guard by the directness of the question. "I like people who tip well," she said with a small smile, deflecting the moment with humor. Alexander almost laughed. It was a strange, unfamiliar sound, rusty from disuse, but real nonetheless. "I'll keep that in mind." That evening marked a shift in their conversations, small at first, then gradually deeper. Lily found herself lingering at his table longer than she should have, drawn in by his sharp wit, hidden beneath layers of guarded silence. Alexander found himself looking forward to the moments when she approached, moments that had nothing to do with wealth, status, or the weight of his responsibilities. To Lily, he was not the alpha king. He was simply a man who tipped generously and occasionally smiled when he thought no one was paying attention. "You never told me your name," Lily said one evening, wiping down the table beside his. "Alexander," he said. "And you?" "Lily. Lily Ann Carter." "Lily," he repeated, testing the way it sounded. "It suits you." "Because I'm delicate and pretty?" she teased. "Because you seem to bloom, no matter what conditions you're placed in," he said, surprising even himself with the honesty of the observation. Lily felt heat rise to her cheeks, unsure how to respond to something so unexpectedly sincere, from a man who had spent their first 2 meetings being distant and short with his words. She recovered quickly, offering a light laugh to break the sudden intensity of the moment. "That's either the nicest or strangest thing anyone said to me," she admitted. "Perhaps both," Alexander said, a ghost of a smile playing at the corner of his mouth. Their conversations continued over the following weeks, growing longer with each visit. Alexander began arriving earlier, staying later, finding reasons to extend his time at the modest diner that had somehow become an unexpected refuge from the weight of his responsibilities. Lily found herself saving her energy for his visits, no longer feeling the full exhaustion of her long shifts whenever he was seated at his usual table by the window. She learned small things about him during these visits, pieces he allowed to slip through the careful walls he had built around himself. She learned that he led a large and influential family business, though he was vague about the specific details. She learned that he had lost his mother years ago and rarely spoke of his father. She learned that he had not laughed, truly laughed, in longer than he could remember, until the day she made a joke about the diner's terrible coffee that had him nearly choking with unexpected amusement. In turn, Alexander learned about Lily's life as well, though she offered these details more freely than he did his own. He learned about her grandmother, about the responsibility Lily carried with quiet grace, about the parents she had lost far too young. He learned about her dreams of one day opening a small bakery of her own, dreams she rarely spoke about, because they felt impossibly out of reach given her current circumstances. "Why a bakery?" Alexander asked one evening, genuinely curious. "My mother used to bake," Lily said, her eyes softening at the memory. "Every Sunday, no matter how tired she was from work during the week. She said baking was the one thing that made her feel like the world made sense, even when everything else felt chaotic. I used to help her, and it's still the happiest memories I have of her. You could still do it, Alexander said. Open the bakery. Lily laughed softly, though there was no real humor in it. It's not that simple. Bakeries cost money. Ovens, ingredients, a location, things I don't exactly have lying around. Alexander studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes, though he said nothing further on the subject that evening. But the seed had been planted, and Alexander found himself thinking about Lily's dream long after he returned to the cold walls of his estate that night. Their growing friendship had not gone unnoticed. Gregory, ever observant, mentioned it carefully one afternoon, while reviewing reports in Alexander's study. "You've been visiting that diner quite often, my lord," Gregory said, choosing his words with obvious caution. "Is that a problem?" Alexander asked, not looking up from his paperwork. "Not a problem exactly. Simply unusual. You rarely leave the estate for anything other than business." Alexander set down his pen and looked at Gregory directly. "Perhaps I needed a reason to leave the estate that had nothing to do with business." Gregory nodded slowly, understanding more than he said aloud. He had watched Alexander suffer in silence for 2 decades, watched him grow harder and more distant with each passing year, each failed treatment, each doctor who offered nothing but disappointment. If a simple diner and a kind waitress had brought even a small measure of light back into his employer's life, Gregory was not going to be the one to question it. "I only mention it because others have noticed as well," Gregory continued carefully. "Your sister has asked questions. And there are members of the council who do not take kindly to unexplained changes in your routine." Alexander's expression hardened slightly. He knew exactly what Gregory meant. His position as leader had never been entirely secure, despite his family's long history of influence. There were always those within the council who watched for weakness, who waited for any opportunity to challenge his authority, especially given the physical limitations that had defined his leadership for the past 20 years. "Let them talk," Alexander said finally. "I am still capable of leading this family, regardless of where I choose to spend my evenings." But even as he said the words, a small worry settled into his chest, one he was not yet ready to fully examine. He had grown used to guarding every part of his life from outside interference, and the thought of Lily becoming a target for whispers and suspicion within his world unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. That evening, Alexander visited the diner once again, and as always, the moment Lily approached his table with her easy smile, most of his worries faded into the background. She had a way of making the world feel smaller and simpler, a way of reminding him that not everything needed to be a battle for power or a display of strength. "You look tired," Lily observed, studying his face carefully. "I have a lot on my mind," Alexander admitted, surprising himself with the honesty of the response. "Want to talk about it?" Alexander considered the offer for a long moment. 20 years of guarding his thoughts from everyone around him, 20 years of showing nothing but strength and control to a world that constantly searched for signs of weakness. And yet, sitting across from this woman, who owed him nothing and expected nothing in return, he felt something loosen in his chest, some old defense mechanism beginning to crack. "Not tonight," he said finally, "but thank you for asking." Lily nodded, respecting the boundary without pushing further, another quality Alexander had come to appreciate deeply. She did not demand explanations. She did not pity him. She simply offered her presence, steady and warm, without asking for anything in return. As the weeks continued to pass, the bond between them deepened in ways neither of them had anticipated, growing from simple curiosity into something that felt increasingly significant, though both remained careful not to name it directly. For Alexander, the diner had become an escape from the crushing weight of his responsibilities and his broken body. For Lily, his visits had become a bright spot in an otherwise exhausting routine, a reminder that even in difficult circumstances, unexpected connections could still bloom. Neither of them yet understood the strange sensations that had begun stirring quietly within Alexander's legs during their time together, faint and easily dismissed as imagination. But the storm that had first brought them together had only been the beginning, and the true changes were only just starting to take root. It happened on a Friday evening, so subtly at first that Alexander nearly dismissed it entirely. He had been sitting in his usual booth, watching Lily move between tables with her practiced ease, when a strange warmth spread through his left leg. It was faint, barely noticeable, similar to the feeling of a limb waking up after sitting in an awkward position for too long. Alexander froze, his hand gripping the edge of the table, waiting to see if the sensation would return or fade away like so many false hopes before it. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, faintly, he felt it again. A tingling warmth, traveling from his knee, down toward his ankle, gone as quickly as it appeared. His heart pounded in his chest. 20 years of nothing. 20 years of complete silence from the waist down. No sensation, no feeling. Nothing but empty space, where movement used to exist. And now, out of nowhere, the faintest whisper of something returning. "Alexander?" Lily's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She stood beside his table, concern etched across her face. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Is everything okay?" Alexander blinked, trying to compose himself. "I'm fine," he said, though his voice carried an unfamiliar tremor. "Just a strange feeling." "A strange feeling," Lily repeated, tilting her head slightly. "It's nothing," Alexander said quickly, unwilling to explain something he barely understood himself. "Probably just fatigue." Lily studied him for a moment longer, clearly unconvinced, but she let the matter drop, respecting his obvious desire to move past it. She refilled his coffee and returned to her other tables, leaving Alexander alone with his racing thoughts. He left the diner earlier than usual that evening, his mind consumed entirely by what had just happened. On the drive home, he sat in silence, staring down at his legs, as if he could will the sensation to return through sheer determination alone. Nothing happened. The familiar numbness had settled back into place, as unyielding as it had been for the past 2 decades. Was that imagination? He asked himself quietly, staring out the window as the countryside blurred past. Or something real? He said nothing to Gregory or his sister about the strange sensation, unwilling to raise false hope that would inevitably collapse under the weight of disappointment, the way every other hope had collapsed before it. Instead, he carried the secret privately, turning it over in his mind again and again, searching for any logical explanation. Perhaps it had been a trick of nerves finally reacting after years of dormancy, unrelated to anything specific. Perhaps it had simply been his imagination, desperate for any sign of progress after 20 years of stagnation. Or perhaps, and this thought unsettled him more than any other, it had something to do with Lily's presence. The idea seemed absurd on its surface. Alexander was a man who dealt in facts, in logic, in tangible evidence. He did not believe in magical solutions or unexplainable miracles, and yet he could not deny the timing of what had happened. The sensation had occurred while he sat across from her, watching her smile at customers, listening to the easy rhythm of her laughter as she moved through her shift. He returned to the diner the following evening, earlier than his usual visit, driven by a need to test his theory, however irrational it seemed. Lily greeted him with her usual warmth, unaware of the internal storm raging within him. "Back again so soon?" she asked, setting down his coffee. "I couldn't stay away," Alexander said, only half joking. They talked for nearly 2 hours that evening, longer than any previous visit, covering everything from her grandmother's health to his frustration with certain members of his council who seemed intent on undermining his authority at every opportunity. Throughout their conversation, Alexander remained acutely aware of his legs, watching, waiting, hoping for another sign. It came just as he was preparing to leave, a faint tingling in his right foot this time, brief but unmistakable. Alexander gripped the edge of the table, his breath catching in his throat. "Alexander, are you all right?" Lily asked, noticing the sudden tension in his expression. "I felt something," he admitted, before he could stop himself. "In my foot. Just now." Lily's eyes widened slightly. "Felt something? Like what?" "I don't know how to explain it," Alexander said, his voice quieter than usual. "I haven't felt anything in my legs for 20 years. And now, twice in 2 days, something happens when I'm here. With you." Lily stared at him, clearly processing the weight of what he had just shared. "You think it has something to do with me?" "I don't know what to think," Alexander admitted honestly. "It sounds impossible. I know it sounds impossible. But I cannot ignore what I felt." Lily sat down across from him, her expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. "My grandmother used to talk about things like this," she said slowly. "Old stories from her side of the family, about people with certain gifts, certain abilities passed down through generations. I always thought they were just stories, things she told me because her memory liked to wander into fantasy sometimes. What kind of gifts? Alexander asked, leaning forward slightly. Healing, Lily said, almost embarrassed to say the word aloud. She used to say some of the women in our family had the ability to heal others, simply through touch or presence. I never believed it, honestly. It always seemed like one of her confused stories, especially given her condition. Alexander studied her carefully, this new piece of information settling heavily in his mind. And you've never experienced anything like that yourself? No, Lily said, shaking her head. No, I mean, people do say I have a calming effect on them sometimes. Regular customers, co-workers, even my grandmother during her more difficult days. But I always assumed that was just my personality, not some kind of supernatural ability. What if it isn't just your personality? Alexander asked quietly. Lily fell silent, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation had taken. I don't know, Alexander. This all sounds a bit much, don't you think? I'm just a waitress. I don't have magical healing powers. I'm not suggesting you have magical powers, Alexander clarified carefully. I'm simply saying that something happened, twice now, in your presence, after 20 years of nothing happening at all. I've seen countless doctors, tried every treatment imaginable. Nothing has worked, but something about being near you seems to be affecting my body in ways I cannot explain. Lily wrapped her arms around herself, clearly overwhelmed by the implications of what he was suggesting. This is a lot to process, she admitted. I know, Alexander said gently, and I'm not asking you to have all the answers right now. I simply wanted you to know what happened, because I couldn't keep it to myself any longer. They sat together in silence for a few moments, the weight of the conversation settling around them like a heavy fog. Finally, Lily spoke again, her voice quieter than before. My grandmother has old journals, she said, from her mother, and her mother before that. I've never really looked through them carefully. Maybe there's something in there that could explain what's happening, if any of it is even true. Would you be willing to look? Alexander asked. Lily hesitated, clearly torn between curiosity and the fear of what she might discover. Finally, she nodded slowly. I'll look. But Alexander, I need you to understand something. Even if there's some truth to these old stories, I don't know how any of it works. I don't know how to control it, or use it, or whatever it is you're hoping for. I'm not hoping for anything specific, Alexander said honestly. I've given up hoping for miracles a long time ago. I simply want to understand what's happening, whatever the explanation turns out to be. Lily nodded, though the uncertainty remained clear in her expression. That night, after Alexander had left and her shift had finally ended, Lily walked home slower than usual, her mind racing with questions she had never before considered seriously. She thought about her grandmother's stories, dismissed for years as nothing more than the ramblings of an aging mind. She thought about the strange, calming effect she seemed to have on people throughout her life, something she had always attributed to simple kindness rather than anything extraordinary. When she arrived home, her grandmother was already asleep, her breathing steady and peaceful in the quiet house. Lily crept quietly into the small storage room, where old family belongings had been kept for years, untouched and forgotten. She found the journals exactly where she remembered seeing them once, years ago, tucked into a worn wooden box, beneath layers of old photographs and letters. Lily sat on the floor of the storage room, surrounded by dust and memories, and opened the first journal with trembling hands. The handwriting was old and faded, difficult to read in places, but as she began working through the pages, she realized that Alexander's impossible theory might not be quite as impossible as she had first believed. The journal pages told a story Lily had never expected to find, buried within her own family history. Her great-great-grandmother had written in careful, looping handwriting about a gift passed down through the women of their bloodline, a gift she called simply the calm hand. According to the journal, certain women in each generation carried the ability to ease pain and, in rare cases, restore what had been broken within another person's body, though the gift required a genuine bond of trust and care between the healer and the person being healed. It was not something that could be forced or summoned at will. It responded only to sincerity, patience, and time. Lily read through page after page, her fingers trembling slightly as she absorbed details that felt both impossible and strangely familiar. The journal spoke of a great-aunt who had eased the suffering of soldiers returning from war, of a distant relative who had helped children recover from illnesses that doctors had declared incurable. Each account carried the same warning, however. The gift came with limitations, and using it carelessly, or attempting to force results before genuine connection had formed, often led to failure or worse. She closed the journal well past midnight, her mind spinning with questions she could not yet answer. Was this truly connected to what Alexander had experienced? Or was she simply grasping at old family folklore in a desperate attempt to explain something far more logical? She decided not to mention the journals to Alexander immediately, wanting to process the information herself first before adding fuel to something that already felt overwhelming. But as the days passed, and Alexander continued visiting the diner with increasing frequency, Lily found it harder to ignore the pattern that seemed to be forming. Meanwhile, within the walls of the Voss estate, whispers had begun circulating among the family's inner circle. Eleanor, ever perceptive, had noticed her brother's improved mood, the subtle lightness that had crept into his demeanor over the past several weeks. She mentioned it carefully during a family dinner one evening. "You seem different lately," Eleanor observed, watching her brother across the table. "Lighter, somehow." "I don't know what you mean," Alexander replied, though a faint smile betrayed him. "I think you do," Eleanor said, smiling knowingly. "Gregory mentioned you've been visiting a diner in town, quite often apparently." Alexander's expression tightened slightly. "Gregory talks too much." "Gregory cares about you," Eleanor corrected gently. "As do I. I'm not trying to pry, Alexander. I'm simply happy to see you smiling again, whatever the reason." Alexander said nothing further on the matter, though he appreciated his sister's restraint in not pushing the conversation further. Not everyone within his circle showed the same consideration, however. Marcus Hale, a senior member of the family council and a distant cousin with ambitions of his own, had also taken notice of Alexander's unusual behavior. Marcus had never openly challenged Alexander's leadership, understanding the risks involved in confronting a family as powerful and established as the Voss lineage directly. But he had long harbored quiet resentment toward Alexander's position, believing that a leader who could not even walk on his own two legs represented a weakness that threatened the family's reputation among their allies and rivals alike. "Have you heard the rumors?" Marcus asked during a private council meeting, addressing several other members who shared his concerns. "Our leader has been spending considerable time at some common diner, involved with a waitress of no particular importance." "What business is that of ours?" asked one of the older council members, clearly unimpressed by Marcus's insinuations. "It becomes our business when it affects the family's standing," Marcus replied smoothly. "Alexander already struggles to maintain authority, given his physical limitations. If word spreads that he's involved with someone entirely unsuitable for his position, it could weaken our standing among rival families, who already question our strength." The council members exchanged uncertain glances, some sympathetic to Marcus's concerns, others uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Regardless of their individual opinions, the seed of suspicion had been planted, and it would not take long before word of Alexander's growing attachment to Lily spread further throughout the family's inner circles. Unaware of the political tension building around him, Alexander continued his visits to the diner, each evening bringing him closer to Lily, and, strangely, closer to sensations he had once believed permanently lost to him. The tingling in his legs had become more frequent, though still unpredictable, appearing during moments of genuine connection between them, disappearing entirely during the long, lonely hours he spent isolated within his estate. "I found something," Lily said one evening, sliding into the booth across from him instead of standing as she normally did while working. Dorothy had given her permission to take a short break, sensing the importance of whatever Lily needed to discuss. "What did you find?" Alexander asked, setting down his coffee cup. Lily explained the contents of the journals carefully, watching his expression shift from skepticism to something closer to cautious hope as she spoke. She told him about the calm hand, about the women in her family who had carried this unusual gift through generations, about the limitations and warnings that accompanied such abilities. "So you believe it's real?" Alexander asked when she finished. "I don't know what I believe," Lily admitted honestly, "but something is happening between us, Alexander. I've felt it too, honestly. A strange sort of pull, almost like something wants to connect the moments we spend together to whatever is happening with your legs." "What does this mean for us then?" Alexander asked quietly, uncertain himself where this new information left them. "I don't know," Lily said again, her honesty a comfort even amid uncertainty. "But I think it means we should keep spending time together and see where it leads, rather than trying to force something we don't fully understand." Alexander nodded slowly, grateful for her steady, grounded approach to something that could have easily spiraled into desperation or false hope. "I can accept that," he said, slow and honest. No forcing anything. Their bond deepened further over the following days, conversations growing more personal, moments of comfortable silence becoming as meaningful as their words. Alexander found himself sharing pieces of his past he had never shared with anyone outside his immediate family. Memories of his accident, memories of the crushing disappointment that had followed each failed treatment over the years. Lily, in turn, shared her own struggles more openly, admitting the exhaustion of caring for her grandmother alone, the constant worry over finances, the quiet grief she still carried over losing both her parents at such a young age. Their shared vulnerabilities created a foundation of trust that neither of them had expected to find, especially not in circumstances as unusual as theirs. But even as their connection strengthened, the whispers within Alexander's world continued to grow louder. Marcus Hale, emboldened by the support of a few sympathetic council members, began quietly gathering information about Lily, searching for anything that could be used to discredit her or discourage Alexander's growing attachment to someone he considered entirely unsuitable for a family of their standing. Alexander remained largely unaware of these efforts, too consumed by the cautious hope building within him, hope he had not allowed himself to feel in over 20 years. For the first time since his accident, he found himself genuinely looking forward to each day, driven by the possibility that healing, whether through Lily's mysterious gift or simply through the power of genuine human connection, might finally be within his reach. Neither Alexander nor Lily yet understood the full scope of what was happening between them, nor did they realize the dangers quietly gathering around their growing bond. But as the tingling sensations in Alexander's legs continued to strengthen, and as their connection deepened with each passing visit, both of them began to sense that something significant, something life-changing, was steadily unfolding before them. Autumn had settled fully over the valley by the time Alexander found himself waiting outside the diner nearly every evening, no longer bothering to disguise his visits as coincidence or convenience. Everyone at the diner, including the regular customers who had grown used to seeing the elegant black car parked outside, understood by now that Alexander Voss had become a fixture in Lily's evenings, and she in his. "You're early today," Lily said, smiling as she approached his usual booth, though her smile faded slightly when she noticed the tension lining his features. "Difficult morning," Alexander admitted, rubbing his temples. "Council meetings. Reports of a rival family testing our borders again, the usual demands of leadership. You don't have to talk about it if you're too tired," Lily offered gently. "No," Alexander said, surprising himself with his own willingness to continue. "I think I need to talk about it actually. I've spent 20 years handling everything alone. It's exhausting, carrying it all in silence." Lily sat across from him instead of standing, an unspoken signal that she intended to stay longer than usual. "Then don't carry it alone anymore," she said simply. "Tell me." And so, for the first time and longer than he could remember, Alexander truly opened up, sharing the weight of leadership that had rested on his shoulders since he was 25 years old. He spoke of the constant pressure to prove his authority despite his physical limitations, the exhausting effort required to appear strong and unshaken in front of council members who searched constantly for signs of weakness. He spoke of the guilt he still carried over the accident that had changed his life, guilt over disappointing his father's expectations, guilt over failing to become the leader he believed his family deserved. "You were 18, Lily said softly, once he finished. "An accident happened. That's not something you should carry guilt over, Alexander. Accidents are not failures of character. Try telling that to a family who measures worth by strength and capability," Alexander said, though his voice carried less bitterness than it once might have. "For 20 years, I've felt like half a man, leading a family that expects nothing less than absolute power and control. You've led them successfully for over a decade despite everything," Lily pointed out. "That doesn't sound like half a man to me. That sounds like someone who found strength in a different way than everyone expected." Alexander studied her carefully, moved by the simple honesty of her words. No one within his own family had ever framed his leadership in such a way, always focusing instead on what he lacked, rather than what he had managed to accomplish despite his limitations. "You have a way of making difficult things sound simple," Alexander said quietly. Maybe they are simple, Lily replied. Maybe we're the ones who make things complicated, by measuring ourselves against expectations that were never fair to begin with. Their conversation continued late into the evening, long after the diner had closed, and Dorothy had discreetly locked the front door, allowing them privacy while she busied herself with cleaning duties in the back. Alexander shared memories of his mother, memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit given how deeply her loss had affected him. Lily shared memories of her own parents, the aching grief of losing them both so young, the responsibility that had fallen onto her shoulders far earlier than it should have. By the time Alexander finally prepared to leave, something between them had shifted permanently. Walls that had once stood firmly in place, now reduced to fragments, scattered across the floor of the quiet diner. "Thank you," Alexander said, as his driver helped him toward the car, "for listening. For not treating me like something fragile or broken." "You're not broken, Alexander," Lily said firmly. "You never were." Alexander held her gaze for a long moment, something warm and unfamiliar stirring within his chest, entirely separate from the strange sensations that had begun returning to his legs. It was a feeling he had not allowed himself to experience in longer than he could remember, a feeling dangerously close to genuine happiness. That night, as he lay in bed within the cold, familiar walls of his estate, Alexander found himself smiling for no particular reason, replaying their conversation over and over in his mind. For the first time in 20 years, the weight of his responsibilities felt slightly lighter, not because anything had changed regarding his physical condition, but because he no longer felt entirely alone in carrying that weight. Meanwhile, within the more shadowed corners of the Voss estate, Marcus Hale continued gathering information, growing increasingly frustrated by his lack of substantial findings against Lily. She appeared to be exactly what she seemed, a hard-working young woman, caring for her ailing grandmother, without any hidden agenda or ulterior motive that Marcus could use against her. "There's nothing suspicious about her," one of Marcus's associates reported during a private meeting. "No debts owed to dangerous parties, no criminal history, nothing that would suggest she's targeting Alexander for financial gain." "Then we create suspicion where none currently exists," Marcus said coldly. "Alexander's attachment to this woman threatens everything our family has worked to build. If we cannot find a legitimate reason to discourage this relationship, we will simply have to manufacture one." His associate hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direction Marcus intended to pursue. "That seems like a dangerous path, Marcus. If Alexander discovers we've fabricated anything against her, the consequences could be severe. The consequences of allowing an unsuitable outsider to influence our leader are far more severe," Marcus replied firmly. "I will handle this matter myself, quietly and carefully. Alexander need not know the details until it becomes necessary." Unaware of the plans forming against her, Lily continued her evenings at the diner, her bond with Alexander deepening further with each passing visit. The tingling sensations in his legs had grown stronger and more frequent, occurring almost every time they spent extended periods together, though the feelings never lasted long enough to translate into actual movement. "Do you think it's really happening?" Alexander asked one evening, staring down at his legs with a mixture of hope and lingering skepticism. "Or am I simply imagining what I desperately want to be true?" "I don't think you're imagining it," Lily said honestly. "But I also don't think we should rush this, Alexander. My grandmother's journals were clear about that. Healing like this, if that's truly what's happening, takes time. It takes genuine trust and connection, not desperation or force." "I trust you," Alexander said simply, the words carrying more weight than either of them had expected. Lily felt her heart tighten slightly at the sincerity in his voice. "I trust you too," she admitted quietly. Their growing bond had become something neither of them could easily define or contain within simple explanations. It was not merely friendship, nor was it something as straightforward as romantic attraction, though elements of both existed within the connection, steadily forming between them. It was something deeper, rooted in genuine understanding, shared vulnerability, and an unspoken hope that perhaps, against every expectation and every disappointment of the past 20 years, healing truly was possible. As autumn deepened into the cooler days of early winter, Alexander found himself increasingly torn between the growing warmth he felt within Lily's presence and the mounting pressures of his responsibilities as leader of his family. The walls he had spent 2 decades building around himself had begun crumbling steadily, piece by piece, replaced by something far more vulnerable, far more human, than he had allowed himself to feel, in longer than he could remember. Neither Alexander nor Lily yet understood the full danger, quietly gathering around them. Danger born from ambition, fear, and the desperate desire of certain individuals to maintain control over a family they believed required strength above all else. But as their connection continued to deepen, so too did the stakes surrounding the choices they would soon be forced to make. The night everything changed began with an emergency call that Lily never expected to receive. Her grandmother had collapsed at home, alone, during one of her confused episodes, striking her head against the kitchen counter as she fell. A neighbor, hearing the crash, had rushed inside and immediately called for help. By the time Lily arrived at the hospital, breathless and terrified after receiving the panicked phone call during her shift, her grandmother had already been rushed into emergency care. Lily sat alone in the crowded waiting room, her hands trembling as she waited for any update on her grandmother's condition. She had no one else to call, no family remaining beyond the fragile, elderly woman currently fighting for stability behind closed hospital doors. The weight of her isolation pressed down on her harder than it ever had before. Without fully considering what she was doing, Lily pulled out her phone and called Alexander. He answered on the second ring. "Lily, is everything all right?" "It's my grandmother," Lily said, her voice breaking despite her efforts to remain composed. "She fell. She's in the hospital. I don't know what's happening, and I don't know who else to call." "I'm on my way," Alexander said immediately, without hesitation. Within 30 minutes, Alexander arrived at the hospital, wheeled quickly through the entrance by his driver, his expression set with fierce determination, despite the physical limitations that had defined his life for the past 20 years. He found Lily still sitting in the waiting room, her face pale with worry, tears finally beginning to fall, now that she was no longer facing the crisis entirely alone. "Alexander," she said, standing quickly as he approached. "I'm here," he said simply, reaching for her hand. The moment their hands connected, something extraordinary happened. Alexander felt a sudden, powerful surge of warmth flooding through his entire body, starting from his hand and spreading rapidly down through his chest, his abdomen, and finally into his legs. It was unlike anything he had experienced during their previous encounters, far stronger, far more immediate. His breath caught sharply in his throat, as sensation flooded into muscles that had remained silent and unresponsive for 20 long years. "Alexander?" Lily asked, noticing his sudden stillness. "What's wrong?" "My legs," Alexander said, his voice barely above a whisper, disbelief evident in every syllable. "Lily, I can feel my legs." Lily's eyes widened in shock. "What do you mean, you can feel them?" "I mean I can actually feel them," Alexander repeated, staring down at his legs, as if seeing them for the first time in years. Carefully, hesitantly, he attempted to move his right foot, an action that had been utterly impossible for 2 decades. His foot twitched slightly, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but movement nonetheless. Lily gasped, quickly kneeling beside his wheelchair to watch more closely. "Try again," she urged quietly. Alexander focused intensely, channeling every ounce of concentration he possessed, into the simple act of moving his foot once more. Slowly, painstakingly, his foot shifted again, more noticeably this time, the muscles responding weakly but undeniably to his mental command. Tears filled Alexander's eyes, 20 years of frustration, disappointment, and quiet despair finally breaking through the careful composure he had maintained for so long. "It's real," he whispered. "It's actually real." Their emotional reunion was interrupted moments later by a doctor emerging from the emergency room, informing Lily that her grandmother had stabilized, suffering a mild concussion, but expected to make a full recovery with proper rest and care. Relief flooded through Lily immediately, compounding the overwhelming emotions already stirred by Alexander's sudden breakthrough. "Thank you," Lily said to the doctor, before turning back toward Alexander, still visibly shaken by what had just occurred. "I don't understand how this happened," Alexander admitted, staring at his legs with a mixture of joy and confusion. "Nothing like this occurred during any of our previous visits, not even close to this intensity." "Maybe it needed something more," Lily said thoughtfully, recalling the details from her grandmother's old journals. The book mentioned genuine emotional connection, moments of real vulnerability and need. Tonight, Everything was heightened. Fear, worry, genuine crisis. Maybe that intensity triggered something stronger. Alexander considered her words carefully, the pieces slowly beginning to fit together in his mind. Every time I've felt something before, it happened during moments when we were completely honest with each other. Tonight, that honesty reached an entirely different level. They sat together in the hospital waiting room for a long while afterward, processing the significance of what had just occurred. Alexander continued practicing small movements, gaining slightly more control with each attempt, though the process remained slow, deliberate, and clearly far from complete. "This doesn't mean everything is instantly fixed," Lily cautioned gently, mindful of her grandmother's warnings about rushing such delicate processes. "We need to be careful, Alexander. This seems like real progress, but healing like this likely needs time and continued effort, not a single dramatic breakthrough." "I understand," Alexander said, though the hope now burning within him felt impossible to fully contain after 20 years of disappointment. "But Lily, for the first time in 2 decades, I finally believe recovery might actually be possible." Once Lily's grandmother had been moved to a stable recovery room, Lily sat beside her bed throughout the remainder of the night, exhausted but unable to fully process the events of the past several hours. Alexander remained by her side as well, refusing to leave despite Lily's insistence that he should return home to rest. "I'm not leaving you alone tonight," Alexander said firmly. "Not after everything that's happened." Lily smiled tiredly, grateful beyond words for his steady presence beside her. "Thank you, Alexander, for being here, for everything." As dawn broke outside the hospital windows, casting soft golden light across the quiet recovery room, Alexander found himself watching Lily sleep peacefully in the chair beside her grandmother's bed, exhaustion finally overtaking her after the emotional intensity of the previous night. He studied her face carefully, filled with gratitude and something deeper, something he was only now beginning to fully understand and accept within himself. For 20 years, Alexander had believed his body was permanently broken, his life forever confined to the limitations imposed by that fateful accident so many years ago. But sitting quietly in that hospital room, watching the woman who had unknowingly become the center of his world, Alexander allowed himself, for the first time in longer than he could remember, to truly believe that his life was not only capable of healing, but perhaps also capable of genuine happiness once again. Word of the incident, however, would not remain contained within the walls of that quiet hospital room for long. By the following morning, whispers had already begun circulating within certain circles of the Voss family, whispers that would soon reach the ears of those determined to see Alexander's growing connection to Lily brought to an abrupt and permanent end. Marcus Hale received the report with a mixture of alarm and calculation. He moved his foot. His associate confirmed quietly during their private meeting the following afternoon. Hospital staff witnessed it. Word is already spreading among the household staff who accompanied him that night. Marcus sat back in his chair, processing this unexpected development with careful precision. He had spent weeks gathering minor pieces of information against Lily, hoping to find something substantial enough to discourage Alexander's growing attachment to her. Instead, he now faced an entirely different problem. If Alexander truly believed this waitress held some connection to his recovery, removing her from his life would become significantly more difficult and significantly more dangerous to attempt. "This changes things considerably," Marcus said finally. "If Alexander regains his physical strength, our position within the council weakens substantially. Right now, several members quietly support increased council authority given his limitations. A fully recovered Alexander would eliminate that leverage entirely. What do you propose we do?" His associate asked. "We accelerate our timeline," Marcus said coldly. "The girl needs to be removed from the situation before this recovery progresses any further. Quietly, without any connection back to our family." His associate shifted uncomfortably. "That sounds like it's moving towards something far more serious than simply spreading rumors, Marcus. Sometimes serious action becomes necessary to protect what matters most," Marcus replied firmly, leaving no room for further debate on the matter. Unaware of the danger now actively being planned against her, Lily continued caring for her recovering grandmother, while balancing her regular shifts at the diner. Alexander visited daily throughout this period, his condition continuing to show slow, steady improvement. He had progressed from small foot movements to actually shifting his legs slightly while seated, and on one remarkable evening, managed to stand briefly while supported carefully by both Lily and his driver, before his legs gave out beneath him. "That's progress," Lily insisted, helping him settle back into his wheelchair after the brief but exhausting attempt. "Real progress, Alexander." "It doesn't feel like enough," Alexander admitted, frustration evident, despite the clear improvement from where he had started. 20 years, and I can barely stand for a few seconds." 20 years is a long time to heal from, Lily reminded him gently. "You can't expect this to reverse overnight. Be patient with yourself." Alexander nodded, though impatience continued gnawing at him privately, a natural response after decades spent desperately hoping for exactly this kind of breakthrough. Still, he trusted Lily's guidance, trusted the careful process they had built together, and continued their evening visits with unwavering dedication. It was during one such evening, nearly 2 weeks after the hospital incident, that danger finally arrived. Lily had left the diner later than usual, having stayed behind to help Dorothy with additional cleaning duties after a particularly busy evening. The streets were quiet and dark by the time she began her walk home, the usual comfort of familiar surroundings, now carrying an unfamiliar edge of unease she could not quite explain. She noticed the unfamiliar car following at a distance, almost immediately, though she initially dismissed her suspicion as simple paranoia. But as she turned down the quiet street leading toward her home, the car's headlights drew noticeably closer, and 2 men emerged quickly from the vehicle, approaching her with clear and deliberate purpose. "Lily Carter?" one of them asked, his tone carrying false politeness that immediately set her instincts on high alert. "Who's asking?" Lily replied, backing away carefully, her heart pounding rapidly within her chest. "We just need you to come with us," the second man said, stepping closer, his expression hardening as Lily continued retreating. Lily turned to run, but the first man moved quickly, grabbing her arm firmly before she could escape. She struggled against his grip, shouting loudly for help, though the quiet street offered little immediate assistance. The men began forcing her toward their waiting vehicle, ignoring her continued resistance. Just as they reached the car, headlights suddenly flooded the street from the opposite direction, accompanied by the sound of a vehicle rapidly approaching. Alexander's car screeched to a stop nearby, having been sent by Alexander himself after growing concerned when Lily failed to answer his usual evening call. Gregory emerged quickly from the driver's seat, immediately assessing the dangerous situation unfolding before him. "Let her go," he commanded firmly, his voice carrying an authority that momentarily startled the 2 men holding Lily. Sensing the situation shifting rapidly against their favor, the 2 men released Lily abruptly, quickly retreating toward their own vehicle and speeding away into the darkness before Gregory could intervene further. Lily collapsed against the nearby wall, her body trembling from the terrifying encounter. Gregory rushed to her side immediately, offering steady support as she struggled to regain her composure. "Are you all right?" Gregory asked urgently. "I think so," Lily managed, though her voice shook considerably. "Gregory, who were they? Why would anyone want to take me?" Gregory's expression darkened considerably, clearly troubled by what had just occurred. "I don't know for certain," he admitted carefully, "but I intend to find out immediately. Alexander needs to know about this right away." They drove directly to the Voss estate, where Alexander waited anxiously, having received Gregory's urgent call during the drive. The moment Lily entered the main hall, still visibly shaken from the encounter, Alexander wheeled toward her as quickly as his chair allowed, his expression a mixture of relief and fierce protective anger. "Lily," he said urgently, reaching for her hands, "are you hurt?" "I'm okay," Lily assured him, though tears finally began falling freely now that she felt safe. "Just frightened. They tried to force me into a car, Alexander. I don't understand why." Alexander's jaw tightened with barely controlled fury. He turned immediately toward Gregory. "Find out who did this, now." "I already suspect Marcus Hale's involvement," Gregory admitted grimly. "His recent behavior has raised considerable concern among several household staff members." Alexander's expression darkened further at the mention of his cousin's name. He had long known Marcus harbored quiet resentment toward his leadership, but he had never anticipated such resentment escalating into a direct and dangerous threat against someone he cared for so deeply. "Bring him here immediately," Alexander commanded, his voice carrying an authority that Gregory had not heard in years, an authority reminiscent of the powerful leader Alexander had once been before his accident stripped away his confidence. As Gregory departed to carry out these orders, Alexander turned back toward Lily, gently pulling her into a careful embrace, his hands trembling slightly from both lingering fear and overwhelming protective instinct. "I should have anticipated this," Alexander said quietly, guilt evident in his voice. "I should have protected you better." "This isn't your fault," Lily insisted firmly, despite her own lingering fear. "You came for me, Alexander. That's what matters." Alexander held her closely, his mind already racing with plans to ensure her safety moving forward, regardless of what confrontation awaited him with Marcus Hale, and whatever conspiracy had been quietly forming against them both. For the first time since his accident, Alexander felt something reignite within him, beyond mere physical healing, a fierce determination to protect what mattered most, no matter the cost required to do so. Marcus Hale arrived at the estate an hour later, summoned under the pretense of an urgent council matter. He walked into the main hall with practiced confidence, unaware that Gregory had already gathered enough evidence linking him directly to the two men who had attempted to abduct Lily. "You wish to see me, Alexander?" Marcus asked smoothly, his expression carefully neutral. Alexander studied his cousin carefully from his wheelchair, anger simmering beneath a surface of controlled calm. "Someone attempted to take Lily from the street tonight," Alexander said quietly, forced her toward a waiting car. "Would you happen to know anything about that, Marcus?" Marcus's expression flickered slightly, though he recovered quickly. "That's troubling news. Is she all right?" "She's shaken, but safe," Alexander replied evenly. "No thanks to whoever orchestrated the attempt." "Surely you don't believe I had anything to do with something so reckless," Marcus said, feigning offense. "Gregory has already spoken with the men responsible," Alexander said calmly, watching Marcus's composure crack slightly further. "They were quite forthcoming once properly questioned. Your name came up rather quickly." Marcus's face paled visibly, his careful mask finally slipping entirely. "Alexander, you must understand. I only wanted to protect our family's standing. This woman, whatever her intentions, represents an unacceptable risk to everything we've built." "She represents nothing but kindness and honesty," Alexander said, his voice rising with barely contained fury. "Something this family has apparently forgotten how to value, given how quickly you resorted to violence against an innocent woman, simply because her presence threatened your own ambitions. You cannot possibly believe a common waitress deserves a place beside our family's leader," Marcus argued, his desperation increasingly evident. "Your judgment has clearly been compromised, Alexander. I acted only out of necessity, for the good of everyone within our family." Alexander's expression hardened completely, all traces of his earlier calm evaporating entirely. Slowly, deliberately, using strength he had not possessed in 20 years, Alexander gripped the armrests of his wheelchair and pushed himself upward, standing shakily, but unmistakably on his own 2 feet for the first time in 2 decades. The entire hall fell into stunned silence. "I built this family's strength through more than physical power, Marcus," Alexander said, his voice steady despite the visible effort required to remain standing. "Something you have clearly never understood. Loyalty, integrity, and genuine leadership matter far more than fear and manipulation." Marcus stared at Alexander in shocked disbelief, clearly unprepared for this dramatic display of recovered strength. "This isn't possible," he stammered. "Believe what you wish," Alexander replied firmly. "But understand this clearly, Marcus. Your actions tonight have proven exactly the kind of leadership our family does not need. You are removed from the council, effective immediately. Consider yourself fortunate that I choose mercy over harsher consequences, given the severity of what you attempted against someone innocent." Marcus opened his mouth to protest further, but the assembled household staff and remaining council members present in the hall offered no support, clearly disturbed by the revelation of his actions against Lily. Recognizing the complete collapse of his position, Marcus turned and departed the estate in humiliated silence, his ambitions thoroughly dismantled by his own reckless decisions. Once Marcus had gone, Alexander's legs finally gave out beneath him, exhaustion from the sudden physical exertion overwhelming his still recovering muscles. Gregory rushed forward immediately, helping him carefully back into his wheelchair, while Lily hurried to his side, concern and admiration mingling clearly across her face. "You stood," Lily said softly, kneeling beside his chair. "Alexander, you actually stood. For you, Alexander said, breathing heavily from the effort. I needed him to understand exactly what kind of strength truly matters. Lily took his hand gently, tears of relief and pride filling her eyes. I'm so proud of you. Over the following days, word of Marcus's betrayal and subsequent removal spread quickly throughout the family's inner circles, along with growing awareness of Alexander's remarkable recovery. Rather than weakening his position as many had once assumed his condition might, Alexander's continued progress, combined with his firm handling of Marcus's betrayal, only strengthened respect for his leadership among those who had previously questioned his capability. Eleanor visited him the following morning, finding her brother in noticeably better spirits despite the previous night's dramatic events. I heard what happened, she said, sitting beside him. Marcus's arrogance finally caught up with him. It did, Alexander agreed. Though I owe much of my strength to someone else entirely. Eleanor smiled knowingly. Lily, you mean? Lily, Alexander confirmed, warmth evident in his voice. I'm happy for you, brother, Eleanor said sincerely. Truly happy. I haven't seen you this alive in longer than I can remember. Alexander's recovery continued steadily over the following weeks, his strength gradually returning through consistent effort, careful therapy, and the continued emotional support that Lily provided throughout the process. Each small victory, each new movement regained, brought them closer together, their bond deepening far beyond anything either of them had originally anticipated when their paths first crossed during that stormy evening at the small diner. Yet even as Alexander's physical recovery progressed, both of them understood that greater challenges still remained ahead, challenges related not only to his continued healing, but to the future they were beginning to envision together. A future that would require Alexander to fully reconcile his responsibilities as leader of his family, with his genuine desire to build a life alongside someone the world outside their bond might never fully understand or accept. 6 months passed before Alexander stood before his family's full council, without the wheelchair that had defined his existence for 2 decades. The transformation had not been instant or magical, despite how it may have appeared to those observing from a distance. It had been the result of patient, consistent effort, countless hours of careful physical therapy, and the steady emotional foundation Lily had helped him build throughout the entire process. There had been setbacks along the way, days when his legs refused to cooperate, days when frustration threatened to overwhelm the hope they had worked so hard to nurture. But through it all, Lily had remained steadily by his side, guiding him with the same patient wisdom that had first drawn Alexander to her all those months ago. Standing now before the assembled council, dressed formally, his posture strong and confident, Alexander addressed the members who had once quietly doubted his capability to lead. 20 years ago, an accident changed the course of my life, Alexander began, his voice carrying clearly through the grand hall. For 2 decades, I led this family from a wheelchair, proving that strength comes in many forms, beyond simple physical capability. Today I stand before you, not because my recovery makes me a better leader than I was before, but because the journey toward this recovery taught me something far more valuable than physical strength alone. The council members listened intently, many visibly moved by his words. I learned that true strength lies in vulnerability, in trust, in the willingness to accept help and connection, rather than facing every challenge in isolated silence, Alexander continued. I learned this lesson from someone this family initially deemed unsuitable for a position beside me, someone whose kindness and integrity ultimately proved more valuable than any title or status could ever provide. He gestured toward the entrance, where Lily stood quietly, dressed simply, but elegantly, her presence commanding quiet respect, despite her humble origins. Murmurs rippled through the assembled council members as she stepped forward to stand beside Alexander. I intend to claim Lily Ann Carter as my chosen partner, both in leadership and in life, Alexander announced firmly. I understand this decision challenges certain traditions our family has upheld for generations. But I have come to believe that true leadership requires the courage to redefine outdated traditions when those traditions no longer serve the genuine well-being of our family. Silence hung heavily in the grand hall following his declaration. Then, slowly, one by one, council members began to nod in quiet acceptance, moved by the sincerity of Alexander's words and the undeniable transformation they had witnessed unfold before them over the preceding months. Eleanor stepped forward first, embracing her brother warmly, before turning to embrace Lily as well. "Welcome to our family," she said sincerely, tears glistening in her eyes. Gregory followed closely, offering a respectful bow toward Lily, a gesture of genuine acknowledgement rather than mere formality. "It has been my honor to witness this journey," he said quietly, "both of yours." As the remaining council members offered their own gestures of acceptance, Alexander turned toward Lily, taking her hands gently within his own, standing tall and steady on legs that had once seemed permanently lost to him. "None of this would have been possible without you," Alexander said softly, meant only for her ears despite the crowded hall surrounding them. "You didn't just heal my body, Lily. You healed everything 20 years of isolation had broken within me." "We healed each other," Lily corrected gently, her eyes shining with quiet happiness. "I was lost too, in my own way, carrying burdens alone that I never thought anyone would understand. You gave me that understanding, Alexander, the same way I hope I gave it to you." Months later, Lily's small bakery finally opened its doors on the edge of town, funded not through financial rescue or handouts, but through Alexander's genuine belief in her dream, and his practical support in helping her build something entirely her own, separate from his family's wealth and influence. The bakery quickly became a beloved fixture within the community, its warm aroma of fresh bread drawing customers from across the valley, a living tribute to the mother whose memory had inspired Lily's dream in the first place. Lily's grandmother, fully recovered from her earlier fall, often sat contentedly near the bakery's front window, watching her granddaughter's dream flourish with quiet pride, occasionally sharing stories from decades past with customers who lingered to listen. Alexander, meanwhile, continued leading his family with renewed strength and wisdom, his leadership now shaped by the valuable lessons learned throughout his long journey toward recovery. He led not through fear or rigid control, but through genuine understanding, compassion, and the quiet confidence of a man who had faced his darkest moments and emerged stronger, both physically and emotionally, on the other side. Their story became a quiet legend within the valley over time, whispered among those who witnessed its unfolding, a reminder that true strength often emerges not from wealth, status, or physical power alone, but from genuine connection, patience, and the courage to remain vulnerable, even after decades of guarded isolation. Alexander Voss, once known throughout the region as the fallen king, trapped within his own broken body, had become something far greater than the powerful leader he once believed himself destined to be. He had become a man capable of standing, not merely on his own 2 feet, but confidently beside someone who had taught him the true meaning of strength, resilience, and unconditional love. And Lily Ann Carter, the humble waitress who had once believed her life would remain forever defined by hardship and quiet sacrifice, discovered that even the smallest acts of genuine kindness held the power to reshape not only her own destiny, but the destiny of an entire kingdom that had long forgotten what real strength truly meant. Together, they built a life grounded not in the shadows of past suffering, but in the steady light of hope, healing, and enduring love, proving that even after 20 years of unanswered prayers, miracles could still find their way home, when least expected, carried gently by the kindness of a single, unforgettable soul.